It's a big day in federal legal circles as we see a high-profile departure and prepare for an historic arrival. Last night, President Trump fired the acting attorney general for refusing to defend his executive orders instituting a 90-day travel ban from 7 majority Muslim countries and indefinitely suspending the relocation of Syrian refugees. Tonight, in a televised address, the president will announce his nomination to the Supreme Court to replace the seat made vacant by the death of conservative stalwart Antonin Scalia last February. First, the case of Sally Yates, an Obama appointee who had been the acting attorney general while the Senate confirmation of Senator Jeff Sessions played out. Yates instructed judiciary employees not to enforce Trump's executive order, believing it didn't pass constitutional muster. Take a listen to her confirmation hearing back in 2015 when she was being questioned by none other than Senator Sessions.
You have to watch out because people will be asking you to do things you just need to say no about. Do you think the Attorney General has a responsibility to say no to the President if he asks for something that's improper? But if the views the President wants to execute are unlawful, should the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General say no?
Senator, I believe that the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General has an obligation to follow the law and the Constitution and to give their independent legal advice to the President.
Some Democrats are even comparing Yates' sudden termination to President Nixon's so-called Saturday Night Massacre when he fired his Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General after they ignored his instructions to get rid of a special prosecutor during Watergate.
Sally Yates was a profile in courage. Profile in courage. Maybe some of her courage, her insight, her wisdom would rub off on the people in the White House.
Trump tweeted, "When will the Democrats give us our Attorney General and rest of cabinet? They should be ashamed of themselves. No wonder D.C. doesn't work." Today, some Democrats said they would not support Jeff Sessions as Attorney General because they don't believe he would be willing to confront President Trump the way Yates did. Joining me with insight on this judicial drama are retired federal judge Nancy Gertner. She's now teaching at the Harvard Law School. Judge, it's good to see you. And Charles Freed, who was Solicitor General of the U.S. under President Reagan, served as Associate Justice on the Massachusetts highest court, and also teaches now at Harvard Law. Professor, it's very good to meet you.
It's good to be here.
So much is being made, Professor, of the firing of Sally Yates, and maybe it could have been handled on both ends, but to me it's not that big a deal, and it surely is not in Saturday Night Massacre territory. Where are you on this?
Exactly where you are. We have what's called a unitary executive. That's Hamilton's phrase. The president is responsible for the executive branch. And if Sally Yates thinks, and that's a reasonable thought, that she can't in good conscience do what the president wants, she should resign. No big deal, not a fuss. As the government's chief advocate in the Supreme Court, I often worried whether the White House would dislike a position that I took. And if they said, no, you got to do it anyway, I'd say, fine, get somebody else to do it. I don't need the job.
But she didn't even resign. She decided, I don't know if it's, she almost like she wanted to become a martyr here. Take her position, right. Get fired. You where the professor and I are, or no?
Well, I'm in between. How remarkable, right? On the one hand, it's not the Saturday Night Massacre. There's no question about it. On the other hand, it is a big deal when someone of this stature says, President, what you're doing is unconstitutional. As she put it, it was, I'm not convinced that the executive order is lawful. She has a right to that determination. There may have been a less public way of doing it.
On both ends.
On both ends, but I don't have any problem with the way that she did it.
But the mistake is she was in OLC. In OLC, what you do...
Office of Legal Counsel.
Thank you.
Right.
You give advice and you say what you think. In this position, she was supposed to be an advocate. And the notion that the president could not put his case before a court, which would decide this, was, I think, excessive.
I think the ruling is 3-0. Can we? I want to go to the big one.
Okay.
I just felt.
But there's a range of lawfulness, and I think she was saying this is outside the range.
Okay,
but okay.
Let's go.
He may very well win in court. That
likely.
will be an embarrassment.
Let's go to the biggest story, one with the potential to influence just about every aspect of American life for decades to come. President Trump's nominated to the Supreme Court, scheduled to be announced tonight in about an hour at 8 o'clock. Supreme Court justices, as you know, are appointed for life. Consider the case of Justice Clarence Thomas, nominated at the age of 43. If he serves until the current age of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, his tenure would hit 40 years. That's 10 presidential terms with multiple occupants and ideology at the White House. And while tonight's nominee will replace a conservative, two of the older justices are liberal. Bader Ginsburg is 83, Stephen Breyer from Cambridge is 78. Justice Anthony Kennedy, a swing vote for liberals on abortion and affirmative action, is 80. So there could be more. Trump has promised to pick a pro-life justice. In fact, last year, I asked then-candidate Trump about the idea of using a litmus test for Supreme Court nominees.
We want good, strong, conservative people that are extremely smart. I'm pro-life, and I would put in pro-life.
There are reportedly two leading candidates. Massachusetts native Thomas Hardiman, currently an appeals court judge in Pennsylvania, was raised in Waltham. He put himself through law school at Georgetown, driving a cab, would be the only justice who didn't attend an Ivy League school, big advocate of gun rights. Neil Gorsuch is also an appeals court judge, and I found out just a student of Charles Fried's, but is based in Denver. He earned his law degree at Harvard as an appeals court judge, wrote an opinion in favor of Hobby Lobby's refusal to provide employees with health insurance for contraceptives.
Affirmed by the Supreme Court, by the way.
That's correct. Now, let's start here. Again, not a big deal. There's a lot of nervousness, Professor, about this first pick. But since a conservative is replacing a conservative, the impact of this on the direction of course is fairly negligible. Is that not fair to say?
Negligible, except for the demographic point you made, that the older justices are all Democrat appointed and more on the liberal wing. And that means that there's a greater vulnerability.
And these two men are 49 and 51,
That's right.
I should say. There's been, you and I discussed the other day, this is that public employee union case about non-member fees. There was 4-4. There's a likelihood that'll come up again, and it may be bad news for public employee unions.
Right. There was a 5-4 split before Scalia passed, and then there have been 4-4 splits during the course of the year, which could change. Actually, there's an interesting perspective here. Some of the Democrats are talking about how you have to put in context this pick with the Republicans' failure to confirm Merrick Garland for a year and a half, that somehow this is what a president who was concerned actually about real consensus in the country, and he of course is not, would say confirm Merrick Garland and you'll get the next pick, which is the way things ought to have been.
Senator from Oregon, we'll play him in a minute, called it a stolen seat.
That's right.
I asked her the other day, that being her being Judge
That's
Gertner,
right.
if Ruth
Judge
Bader
Nancy
Ginsburg
to
should
you.
recuse herself from cases involving the Trump administration because of her comments to CNN that Trump was a fake. She said no. Should she?
There is no rule about recusal. And if talking too much is a ground for recusal, then we wouldn't have heard as much from Scalia. We wouldn't have heard as much from Brennan. They're very talkative.
Okay, so there are no rules. Let me tell you another area where I think there are no rules. You just heard Donald Trump say on our radio show during the February primary, the primary in New Hampshire, he's going to pick a pro-choice justice. Is it appropriate for a president to have a litmus test? I know he can, or I was going to say, or she can. There aren't any she's yet. Is it appropriate? Is it kosher for this kind of decision or announcement to be made by a president?
It happens. I can't believe that Obama or Clinton would have picked a right to life, anti-Roe v. Wade justice, not for a moment.
So you're not troubled at all by the candidate saying...
I'm troubled because precedent says Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. It should not be overturned. It would be a disaster.
That's not what the president said, by the way. He said
I understand.
Gay marriage is settled law, but for some reason the 40-plus-year-old Roe v. Wade is not settled law.
I argued in the Supreme Court in 1987 in the Webster case that Roe v. Wade, as Archie Cox thought and John Ely thought and Paul Freund thought, was a bad decision. But when I came up for confirmation to the SJC and when I testified before Congress, I said, no, it's settled law. We have the gay marriage. We have Lawrence. It's a decision which has sprouted branches everywhere. You mustn't overturn it.
Okay, I want to get back to the point you made a minute ago, if I can, Judge Gertner. Here is Steve Scalise. He's a majority whip for the Republicans in the House of Representatives, mentioning a point you touched on a minute ago. Here he is.
You've already got Senate Democrats saying that they're going to oppose President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court before they even know who it is. That's an incredible level of irresponsibility.
So should the Democrats do unto Donald Trump's pick what Republicans did unto Merrick Garland?
No.
Why not?
Because we have to have a functioning Supreme Court. Because it seems to me it's much better to have a searching confirmation. You know, it's interesting. Wanting to overturn Roe v. Wade doesn't necessarily forecast the position that the justice will take in lots of other areas. True. There will be lots of issues of executive power that will be coming up, as to which the conservative Republican judiciary is actually quite interesting. They were quite aggressive with respect to Obama on his executive orders. So I'm troubled by a litmus test, but, you know, the horse is out of the barn for the past 40 years. You can't undo this confirmation approach.
Let me quote somebody else. Barack Obama said about 1,000 times, elections have consequences. And see if we can have agreement here. If a nominee has a big brain, whoever he decides tonight, and is mainstream and is not, as Ted Kennedy said of Robert Bork, Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors. If they're mainstream and they're smart, they got to be confirmed, don't they?
Well, I mean, I think the question is, who is in the category that Kennedy was talking about? I mean, when you're talking about someone who's sort of beyond the pale of what the mainstream is, you're talking about what the issue is, the definition of mainstream, right? I mean, somebody wants to overturn Roe v. Wade, who wants to overturn, you know, Plessy,
Lawrence,
right, or even, you know, go back to a different view of racial rights, will be beyond the pale.
Well, the third guy was in this mix. This prior guy said the worst abomination in constitutional history is Roe v. Wade.
Right.
He apparently is not getting invited to Washington. But what we know of Hardiman and Gorsuch, they're mainstream conservatives,
I
are they
know
not?
very little about Hardiman. Gorsuch is a very good person. He is.
How do you do in your class?
I'm not free to say, and I don't know. But he's a very smart guy and a very courteous person. He's very much liked by his Democratic colleagues. He teaches. His students love him there in Colorado. And he's scholarly.
And he's also confirmed, as they both were, to the
Right,
federal bench,
right.
virtually unanimously. What's at risk here, quickly, if we can, Professor? And not with the first seat, but if there's a second seat, if it's Bader Ginsburg's, if it's Breyer's, what do you worry about being at risk with a sixth, with another Trump appointee?
I'm afraid of erosion. And erosion leads to a breaching of the dike.
Give me a concrete example of what that breaching might look like.
You can have a death of 1,000 cuts to Roe v. Wade, which they would have done in the Texas, in the Texans abortion.
You're right. You have a right to abortion, but you have no place to be able to use it.
That's right.
Kind of
Texas
thing.
is an over-regulation case, essentially.
Is that the same sort of worry you have? This sort of breach that?
No, I mean, to some degree, the Texas case was actually unusual for the past 15, 20 years. It was a time when the Supreme Court said regulation is one thing, we can limit this right in all sorts of ways, but this was a bridge too far. That was actually a remarkable decision. To go back now and basically begin to kill Roe v. Wade with 1,000 cuts begins to undermine the concept of a constitutional right, which then can bleed into other areas.
This is like a love fest. Before you two go, I have a solution here. Here's Stephen Breyer on this show maybe a year or so ago. Here he is.
I would say there should be a long tenure. Whether it's a term of years or not, maybe it would be better to have a term of years, but it must be long, because you don't want a person in that job thinking about his next job.
Professor, the question I asked was about term limits. I was making the contention to him, these nominations would be far less charged if we knew, maybe somebody we don't agree with is going to be on the bench, but not for 47 years. Am I right or no?
I think you've got a very good point. Other countries that have constitutional courts have 12-year terms. Germany, for instance, very distinguished constitutional court. And I believe non-renewable. 12 years. That's reasonable.
Let's get the final word.
I don't think that it's going to matter, because the fact of the matter is that we play out major political issues in our courts. The Supreme Court has been essentially the territory where we litigate fundamental principles. And as long as that's the case, it seems to me there will be a fight no matter what.
Do you ever think Charles Fried and I would be walking lockstep for 10 minutes? Nice to see you, Nancy Gertner. Charles Fried,
good to see you,
Jim. Thanks so much for being here.